Good morning and welcome to the Point. Happy to have with us the chairman of the House Education Committee, Representative Lisa Lyons. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rick, for having me. I appreciate it.
We're just talking about education. It's always a hot button issue, and there's never a chance to make everybody happy, as is the case with a lot of government. But in this particular case, there is a lot going on surrounding education. One of the things that we heard a lot about in the past couple of weeks is Common Core. We only have about 12 minutes, so you can't explain all of it. But this is something that's been talked about here in the state for the past few years. But just this year in the budget process over in the House, some of your colleagues said, wait a minute, let's take a closer look. Tell me what it is and where we are.
Sure. Common Core is a set of standards, national standards that were brought about by participants from the National Governors Association. They were recommendations. Michigan adopted to go to the Common Core state standards starting next year, and that was back in 2010, I believe, or 2009. And now they've been working to do pilot programs, investing, money and really working with the educators on this brand new way of these brand new standards that we want to see in classrooms throughout the nation. There are 46 states who have adopted the Common Core state standards.
So it makes it very common, if you will. Then as you go from state to state, you're really comparing apples to apples to apples.
Truly, we're a mobile society, and we wanted to make sure, well, I don't say we because I was not a part of this, but the genesis behind the Common Core state standards is to make sure that a student in Arizona is comparable to a student in Michigan. Now, remember, these are just standards. Part of the Common Core standards still allows for local school districts in the state to set their curriculum, and so it's gotten a lot of attention because it's new. It's kind of confusing, and there are folks who believe that this could lead to a federal curriculum or a federal government takeover.
So let's talk about that, because this wasn't something that came from Washington handed down from the states. It was in fact not the Republican Governors or the Democratic Governors Association, but the National Governors Association. And it was the governors who said, what if we would standardize the outline of a curriculum so I know if my state is competing with your state when it comes to educating the future workers. I mean, that was kind of where this began. Truly,
that is where it began. And with regards to the standards versus the curriculum, it's really important to make a distinction. Standards say, what do we want the students to know? And the curriculum is, how do we want to teach them? And there is a difference, but it's untested on a statewide level. And so I think for us, we have members who are very concerned about what that impact is going to be. And so we've decided, I've set up a subcommittee to explore Common Core in an in-depth level and really separate fact from fiction, ask tough questions that I think people have a right to know. There are some concerns that I have. Number one is making sure our students' private information is protected and not able to be sold. Those questions have to be answered.
Why would that be? Why would private information be more susceptible under this than it would under something
Frankly,
else?
I don't know. And that's why we need to ask these questions, because there are a group of opponents out there who believe that to be the case. And if that's true, that is concerning to me, not just as a legislator, but as a parent with kids in our public schools.
But the fact is, this has been underway here in the state. The preparation's already begun. School districts have been training for this. They've been setting up, preparing for it, and the money has been allocated. The phrase that was used by those people who were concerned, they wanted to put a pause on the money from a budgetary standpoint. But that needs to kind of get rectified sooner rather than later if you're going to get these school districts back on board.
That's correct. We have in the budget, there is a pause, or there's a stipulation that the legislature has to affirmatively approve of Common Core before any more state dollars can go towards the implementation of the Common Core state standards.
But the money's already allocated.
Actually, it's allocated, but it is not going to be appropriated. And so before the budget takes effect on October 1st, the legislature, to be responsible to the schools, needs to have this issue sorted out.
That is one issue that you're working on. If that were the only one, it would keep you busy, but there's a lot more going on. We were talking about something that is sure to create controversy for some groups, and other groups will say, you mean we're not already doing that? And it has to do with evaluating educators. Tell me what the process is and what you have in mind when you talk about it.
Sure. As part of the 2011 teacher tenure reform, where we kind of got rid of the last in, first out policies that were really hampering our successful teachers from getting ahead, as part of that, we were stipulated that we would set up an evaluation process, not just for educators, but for administrators as well. And we have spent the last 2 years about studying it's called the Educator Effectiveness Council, and they've just put out their recommendations about a week and a half ago, and we're still actually looking through the recommendations. Some of them are very positive, and so what we want to do is take those recommendations and get a framework for how should we evaluate our teachers and how should we evaluate our administrators. It's very, very important that we do this right, because if you're talking about measuring student growth, and evaluating our teachers and potentially paying the good teachers or rewarding good teachers, what is that based on? And so that's the question. That's what we're going to be exploring over the next month and a half or so. It's going to be hot, but I think everybody agrees that education professionals should be evaluated and held accountable to high standards.
Again, that is going to be something that is going to have to be uniform from district to district to make it fair. So here we were talking about two things in the first 5 minutes or so of the show that really have this universal approach coming from Lansing largely out to local school districts. And there's some people right now looking at their television saying, wait a minute.
Yep.
Schools ought to be under local control, and here you are saying we're going to have this core curriculum or the Common Core. We're going to have these teacher evaluations that are going to look the same in all of these districts. To those people who say we have our own school board, we have our own folks who oversee this, we'd like to take care of our own schools, you say what?
I say I couldn't agree more. And when it comes to the Common Core state standards, I would urge all of our local school districts to make sure that they are setting the curriculum that they believe is in the best interest for the kids in their community and what the parents want in that community. When it comes to the evaluations, I believe just like no child learns the same, just like no teacher teaches the same, you can't do a cookie cutter model because there are non-traditional class subjects. In fact, I've been in constant communication with an ag teacher who I very much respect in my district. How do you evaluate a successful agri-science teacher or a successful vocational education teacher? How do you evaluate music and arts? And those are the things that we have to look at on a broader level as we go through these discussions. But additionally, we do need to keep those evaluations unique to each school district as well.
But you still have to have the same common kind of measurement. So
Right.
it does become tricky. We got about 4 minutes left
Yep.
in this segment. So here's what I want to talk about. Something happened over the past few months that shook some people to the core, and that is at least 2 school districts within this state were found to be almost as a surprise bankrupt. I say almost as a surprise because there is supposed to be a reporting mechanism that schools give to the state, and the state says you have money to operate and you have to show that you can operate. We've seen schools that have had emergency managers appointed because they were too far in debt, they weren't spending their money appropriately. We've seen school districts that have been taken over in that fashion. But 2 school districts don't exist anymore because at some point it was like, they're broke, they're out of money, and there's no way to pay the debt. The school districts have been dissolved, the students are going to go to other schools, and that all happened in a pretty short period of time, at least the legislative part of it.
That's correct. This school dissolution bill dissolved effectively the 2 schools, Buena Vista and Inkster, as you mentioned, literally ran out of money. They will have nothing. They will be able to not open the doors come September. As a legislature, we had to act for those kids. I want them in a classroom. I don't want them on a curbside. It's very important. And it's actually very heartbreaking. And as a parent, it's appalling. There's a lot of blame to go around. Don't get me wrong. It's not just this school, but this district grossly mismanaged their finances to the core. But the oversight, where's the oversight from the Department of Education? The State Board of Education under John Austin, they were allocating money to this district for reasons that they no longer qualified for, and yet the district continued to spend that money. That's irresponsible, and it's negligent at best. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But in the meantime, before we come back in September, school is going to start, and these kids had to have somewhere to go. So we did the school dissolution bill for those two schools primarily.
Those two schools.
But knowing full well, with eyes wide open, that this is a bigger issue that we have to look at, because there are several dozen schools, there's a couple dozen schools on this distressed schools list, and up to a dozen could face the same fate within the next year and a half. And so we're looking for a broad-based solution. How do we get in there early? Can we get an emergency manager in there early? What's the ramifications for this kind of negligence?
And there is a big impact to students. They are going to be going to new schools with new kids, transportation issues,
Correct.
and all of those things that go along. But there is another part of this that I think must be particularly troubling for people who live in those districts, and that is that the taxpayers that live in those districts still are responsible for monies owed by those school districts that are no longer in business and no longer teaching, and will be until that's satisfied. True?
That's correct. The taxpayers in the dissolved district do not have to pay levies or bonds on the receiving districts where the students will be going, but they are being held accountable for the taxes and bonds levied to pay off the debt of the dissolving school.
And this is a subject that's going to come up again, because as this goes forward, as you point out, there are other schools and some that may be in our viewing area that may face similar problems. It'll be interesting to see what you and your colleagues across the aisle come up with as a solution, as always.
We've got a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be a busy fall when you guys get back in full swing. We'll be there too. Thank you, as always, for being with us. We've got more coming up in just a moment. Welcome back to The Point. We're happy to welcome back to the show Representative Sean McCann. He's a Democrat from Kalamazoo. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you again.
You and I have talked a number of times, not necessarily on camera, although we have done a couple of things, but we've talked about something that we both have an interest in, and that is redistricting. Every 10 years, there is a census. Every 10 years following that census, there are new lines drawn for state House and state Senate seats, and maybe as significantly as anything, those U.S. House seats. And you and I have both talked in kind of generic terms about how it's done and why it's done, how it's done. So let's talk about that. Before we get to where we're going to go,
Sure.
Let's talk about how it's done now. Let's say that last year was a census year and this year the lines are going to be redrawn. How would it happen?
Well, and I may not get it exactly right, but basically the legislature, the state legislature, gets to redraw those lines how they see fit within certain state and federal guidelines. Population governs the size of districts. Certain boundaries, municipal boundaries, can play an impact into how things get drawn up. There's some federal laws, the Voting Rights Act, that impacts how minorities may be treated in some districts. But
in some cases, there are required majority-minority districts that have to be created for federal office.
That's right. And but beyond that, there's a lot of latitude to do all kinds of interesting things, and that's kind of what happens. And then depending on the alignment of the power of the legislature, it can become very contentious. It can be very easy. The Supreme Court can get involved. I don't think the governor, I guess the governor signs the bills, and away we go. So.
Well, and so with that being the general basis, and like you say, there are some guidelines, but there is a lot of latitude. And so what it comes down to is who's in charge when it comes time to draw those lines. And it doesn't matter a lot if you go from state to state, if it's Republicans or Democrats.
That's
they
right.
all do the same thing.
Yep.
They draw those districts to be as favorable towards their party as they possibly can. I suspect that's not just human nature, but political nature, and that's the way it's done. In this state, Republicans have been in charge of drawing those lines, largely in charge of drawing those lines for some time, and there are some districts that have gotten kind of odd shapes to them, and you'll be seeing some of those as we talk about them, but you think there's a better way to do that, whether it's Republicans in charge or Democrats in charge. What's your plan?
Great. Well, so a few states have worked on this and come up with different models for a nonpartisan redistricting commission, or bipartisan. There's really no way to sort of totally get partisan politics ideology out of the process, but there's some really inventive ways to get to more of a citizens-based panel that doesn't look at who's the incumbent, doesn't look at what party do we want to be in charge of a certain branch, and doesn't look at what it doesn't look at, has to consider things like, is it a square, is it a reasonable set of boundaries, does it make sense, and can you get to a competitive district? Can you actually do the opposite of what we have now, which is most districts aren't competitive, right. And that really reduces the voters' choices and their representation. So a few states have taken a new approach. California, Arizona, Iowa, and Washington have different models of a panel that draws the boundaries without the politicians basically being directly involved.
And when you talk about, we'll talk about the process, but when you talk about not being competitive, this is what happens. You draw these districts throughout the state that favor your party as best you can. Then there are some areas in the state where your party, you believe, doesn't have a chance. So you draw those and write those off anyway. So what happens in a lot of these districts is after the primary, in the case of state house races, for example, the race is essentially over. There is no general election very many times.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to bring in. I mean, it gets a little out into the weeds when you talk about this, but I know you've got some graphics on hand that I brought, right. And that really makes it crystal clear when people go, oh yeah, I see that. I know that is absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, there's packing of whichever party is going to pack their voters into or out of a district, and then of course it's not only the district, but it's the balance of the legislature. So yes, you get to control a seat, but if you can put as many of the other party's voters into one district, then that leaves more free for your party, and then you get the majority and you perpetuate your political majority, even if that doesn't end up reflecting the overall will of the people in the general elections.
Now, the plan that you have introduced legislation for would give that opportunity to start kind of from square one. One of the other things that you mentioned is it doesn't take into consideration the incumbent in that district. And we know, and again, this is not Republicans or Democrats, it's both parties, that sometimes they will try to draw a sitting member out of a district to make it more difficult. In fact, even for Republicans who drew these last boundaries, one of the local representatives here was thrown into a district with another. He ended up having to move to run in the next district. So those things do happen from time to time, even if it's an unintended consequence. So what would this look like? You'd get a group of how many people looking at a big map and population charts, and they would start drawing lines based on simply geographic location and numbers of people?
Well, it'd be nice to start with, yeah, can we make a square? Can we put squares inside of squares, depending on how it goes? And without regard for those political considerations, but more population, sensible boundaries, a city, townships around a city, things like that. But the one other thing I think that's important to put into the process here, and really what got me going on it, is just this overriding frustration that people have felt with how government doesn't function to the degree that they think it should. I had so many conversations in my first term and now in my second term about how people are frustrated with gridlock and why doesn't anything get done and why are things decided in the primary, and then you've got this candidate who is beholden kind of to whichever base elected them and not really serving the center.
And you say we got these graphics we want to take a look at, but there's some really strangely drawn districts. One here in Grand Rapids, which is State House District, which was the center of some controversy as it's gone forward. But this is one of those districts that's drawn kind of all the way around the edges. Yeah. And then we've got the Peters seat, the congressional district over on the east side of the state, that is also drawn in this long, skinny area. I mean, it's still the same population size of all of the others, right, but it's just drawn in this odd way that takes you from county to county and stretches from Oakland into Wayne, and the whole thing might take you twice as long to drive through it as it should, just because of the way that it's all moved around. And you think your plan could help change all of that?
Yeah, the plan is to get to a panel of people that are able to disregard a lot of those considerations for the most part and look at sort of these guiding principles: contiguous, competitive, fair and population. And the mechanism is kind of cool. When you explain it to people, you talk about what's it like when most people understand the jury selection process. And one side, the prosecution gets to kick out some of the people of the jury that they think is going to be most unfavorable to their case, and the defense gets to do the same thing. That's kind of the way this would work. Is that each side gets a certain amount of strikes. They say, I really don't like that person. I think that they're too ideological. I'm going to strike them out of there because they're not going to help me out. And then the other side does it, and eventually maybe you get down to some people who are really civic-minded, centrist people who are really concerned about having the political process work for the majority of the people.
Not to get too far into this, but just for my own personal information, then this would still have to go through the legislative process, I guess, to get approved, because that would be constitutional.
There's a constitutional change and a legislative piece to it, so it's not easily done, and quite frankly, in most states, it's never been a legislature that's actually done this. It's been a citizens I don't know if that's 100% true for every state, but at least several of them have had to do it by way of citizen referendum, because politicians aren't really in the business of giving up their power easily.
And we talked about this once before. There'll be some folks in your party that aren't going to be wild about this idea, because should you become the majority party at some point down the road, it would take that power out of your hands the same way it would take it out of Republicans' hands. Have you had that phone call from any party leaders yet who have said, wait a minute?
No, not really, actually. So I think that maybe folks are really willing to look for a better way to do this. Otherwise you're just playing the lottery on the decade. Every decade, who's going to end up being in power, what happens on that election, and we see how it's gone in Michigan. So.
And quickly, where does this go from here? If you don't get hearings or it doesn't get passed, are you going to try to take it to a referendum?
That's something I would really seriously consider. I think that that's the case I make, is that if we can't get this through the legislature, it deserves a citizen's opportunity, and I would be very seriously interested in that.
All right, I want you to keep us updated on that. We've got a couple of minutes. I want to talk about something else that you mentioned just as we were sitting down. It's something that a lot of people haven't heard a lot about until recently, and that's fracking. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that process and what's going on. I know one of your colleagues, a Republican, had a hearing not long ago, town hall, I should say, not long ago, trying to get answers, explain it to constituents, hear from the professionals and the people that know about it. As quickly as you can, explain what it is and where your concerns lie.
Yep. New technology lets you get at a lot more natural gas or oil by the injection of water with chemicals into it, deep into the ground, and it breaks apart the ground and releases that oil or gas. And I think the question mainly is it safe, and how much, what's it doing to our environment in the process of extracting this important energy? I mean, domestic energy independence is very important, but not at the cost of our environment. And so one of the bills I've introduced is just asking for how much water is getting used in this process, and are we keeping track of that? Because that could have a bad effect on the environment. We don't know. And what other bills that have been introduced as a part of this would ask, what's in this chemical cocktail that we're injecting into the ground? Is it safe when it's in there, when it comes out? How do we handle it? And I think that, if people really felt well assured that this is a safe process, I think we'd be at peace with it.
And as you say, there's a big upside if we are more energy independent, but because we sit in the middle of the largest freshwater deposit in the world, essentially, you don't want something getting into the groundwater that gets in the Great Lakes that creates a problem. So on these bills, do you expect hearings to come up?
I certainly would love to see hearings happen on them. It's really about transparency and really just knowing more about what's going on. What are we doing to our environment? So I hope so.
And this really has started to kind of bubble to the top, because there are a lot of companies that are proposing to do this in several areas around West Michigan, and there are a lot of communities that have questions.
Well, and you mentioned there's a township issue as far as who's going to govern this at different levels.
Right, and that could create a whole patchwork of different regulations, which would be even more confusing. Representative, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Come back and join us anytime. We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. It's August, and that means that in Washington, both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate have taken a break. They left town, but there's still a lot of heavy lifting to do there, including a budget, a debt ceiling, immigration, and much more, plus still questions about your personal information being stored by the government, the IRS. It looks like fall in Washington could be almost as warm as August. And here in Michigan, the State House and State Senate are still working on some big items. When they come back in late August, we'll be there to follow that as well. We'll see you next Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on To the Point.